My name is Valerie. I am 34 years old, and my entire family sat me down at my own birthday dinner and told me to just accept that my sister was sleeping with my husband. Before I tell you about their smug smiles vanishing when my lawyer stood up, and the world they built on lies came crashing down, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. I love reading about where my listeners are tuning in from. It all started with a scent. It was a Friday evening in late October, and the house was quiet. The kind of quiet that usually felt peaceful after a long week of work, but on this particular evening, it felt heavy and stagnant. The autumn leaves were scraping against the living room windows, driven by a cold wind. My husband, Preston, had just returned home from a 4-day business conference in Chicago. He worked in corporate sales for a large logistics firm. He was always chasing the next big promotion, always talking about how his next bump in salary was going to make our lives completely perfect. He had walked through the front door, dropped his heavy leather suitcase in the hallway with a loud thud, kissed me briefly on the cheek, and immediately gone upstairs to take a shower. He claimed the airplane air made him feel grimy and he needed to wash the travel off his skin. I was doing what I always did in our marriage. I was taking care of the mundane things so he did not have to worry about them. I carried his heavy suitcase down the wooden stairs and into the laundry room in our basement to start a load of wash. The basement was a little damp, smelling of lavender detergent and the metallic heat of the water heater. I placed the suitcase on the folding table, unzipped it, and started pulling out his clothes. I sorted the dark trousers, the gray socks, and the cotton undershirts into separate piles. And then, I pulled out the crisp white dress shirt he had worn on his flight back. As I held the shirt to toss it into the washing machine drum, a smell hit my face. I stopped dead in my tracks. My hands froze in midair. It was a cloyingly sweet, artificial coconut scent. The kind of smell you would find in a cheap body spray from a discount drugstore aisle. It was thick and sugary. I lifted the white collar of the shirt directly to my nose and inhaled deeply. The scent was not faint. It was not something that just brushed past him in a crowded hotel elevator or a busy airport terminal. It was rubbed deep into the fabric of the collar. It was an absolute announcement. My heart gave a painful, heavy thud against my ribs. I knew this smell. I had known it for years. It was the exact, unmistakable scent of the body lotion my younger sister, Daphne, slathered on herself every single day of her life. She bought it by the gallon. She left empty bottles of it in my bathroom whenever she visited. It was her signature scent. I stood there in the cold laundry room, the humming of the water heater the only sound in the entire house, holding my husband's shirt in my trembling hands. It was a small thing, a tiny detail in the fabric of our daily lives, but it felt like a loose thread that, if pulled, could unravel my entire existence. I did not scream. I did not run upstairs and throw the shirt in his face. Instead, I carefully placed the shirt in the washing machine, poured the detergent into the tray, and pressed the start button. The water began to fill the machine. I needed to be absolutely sure. I needed to see his face and watch his eyes when I asked him about it. Later that evening, we were sitting on our living room sofa. I had cooked a roast chicken with vegetables, and we had eaten in relative silence. The television was on, playing some mindless cooking competition show that neither of us was really paying attention to. The room was warm, the ambient light from the television casting long, flickering shadows across the hardwood floor. Preston was relaxed, slouching against the cushions, scrolling through his phone with his thumb, a glass of ice water resting on the wooden coffee table in front of him. I took a deep breath. I focused my eyes entirely on the television screen, trying to make my voice sound completely casual and unbothered, as if I were commenting on the weather. "Your shirt smelled a little like Daphne's lotion today," I said smoothly, not turning my head. "Did you guys meet up for a drink or something while you were out there in Chicago?" Preston did not miss a single beat. He laughed. It was a short, dismissive chuckle that was meant to reassure me, but it only put me more on edge. It sounded rehearsed. "Honey," he said, turning his head to look at me. "Every hotel soap smells the exact same these days. All that coconut and vanilla stuff. It is everywhere. They pump it into the lobbies. He reached out and draped his heavy arm around my shoulders, pulling me closer to his chest. His touch, which had been my ultimate comfort zone for the past 7 years of our marriage, suddenly felt like an iron cage. My skin crawled where his hand rested on my bare arm. "You are working way too hard at the design firm," he continued, his voice dropping into that soothing, patronizing tone he used when he thought I was being difficult or overly emotional. "You are getting a little paranoid, do you not think?" He tilted my chin up with his index finger and thumb, forcing me to look directly into his face. His smile was wide and handsome. The polished smile of a successful salesman closing a deal. But it was just a movement of his lips. His eyes were completely cold. They were watchful, calculating, studying my face intensely to see if I bought his story. He was lying. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name. I felt a hot flash crawl up my neck and spread to my cheeks. I nodded slowly, pretending to agree with him. I told him he was probably right, that I was just tired from looking at computer screens all week. But that feeling of paranoia, as he called it, became my unwanted companion. It followed me through the aisles of the grocery store as I picked out produce. It sat beside me at my desk at work while I designed logos. It tucked me into bed at night, keeping me awake while he snored peacefully beside me. I could not shake the terrifying feeling that my life was a beautifully painted stage set, and the wood supporting the canvas was rotting away. A week later, my terrible intuition found its undeniable validation. Preston announced on a Wednesday evening that he was going on another trip. This time, it was not for work. He told me he needed a solo reset trip to the beach down in Florida. He brought his canvas duffel bag up from the basement and began carefully choosing his expensive linen shirts, his leather sandals, and his designer swim trunks. "I just need to clear my head, Valerie," he said, standing by the front door on Friday morning. "Work has been absolutely brutal this quarter. I am burnt out. I will be back in 3 days, fresh and ready to be a better husband to you." He leaned in and kissed me goodbye with that same hollow, empty affection. I watched his car back out of the driveway and disappear down the street. I spent the weekend in an empty house. The silence was deafening. I cooked single portions of pasta, ate them standing over the kitchen sink to avoid sitting at the large dining table alone, and wandered aimlessly from room to room. I dusted shelves that did not need dusting. I organized my closet. On Saturday afternoon, I was sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of hot chamomile tea, aimlessly scrolling through social media on my phone. The afternoon sun was streaming through the blinds, creating stripes of light on the granite counter. That was when I saw it. Preston had posted a photo on his main social media account. It was the perfect, highly curated shot of a man projecting an image of carefree independence. He was beaming at the camera, his expensive dark sunglasses perched on his nose, a brilliant, crystal-clear blue ocean stretching out behind him. The caption read, "Just what I needed. #solo trip. #recharge." I stared at the picture. I loved that picture for about 10 seconds. My friends were already liking the post, leaving comments about how amazing the water looked, how jealous they were of his vacation, asking him to bring back some sunshine. But something drew my eye. An instinct deeply rooted in my gut that I simply could not ignore. My index finger moved across the bright screen of my phone. I placed 2 fingers on the glass and pinched outward, zooming in on the dark, reflective lenses of his sunglasses. The image was tiny. It was distorted by the curve of the glass, but it was absolutely there. A reflection. A figure standing directly in front of him, holding a phone up to take the picture. It was a woman. Her head was thrown back in laughter, her blonde hair catching the bright beach sun. And she was wearing a bright yellow bikini. Daphne's favorite bright yellow bikini. The one she had bought last summer and bragged about for weeks at family dinners, talking about how perfectly it complemented her skin tone. The world did not just tilt on its axis. It fell away completely, leaving me floating in a silent, airless void. My blood ran completely cold. It was a physical sensation, a literal wave of ice that started deep in my chest and spread all the way down my arms to my fingertips. It felt like a brutal, unexpected punch to the gut that knocked every ounce of oxygen from my lungs. My vision blurred around the edges. I dropped my phone on the kitchen counter as if the metal had suddenly turned red hot and burned my palm. The phone clattered loudly against the granite. I gripped the edges of the countertop to keep my balance, my knuckles turning white. I just stared at the beige wall of the kitchen. I turned my head and looked at the framed photos hanging in the hallway. Photos of our beautiful wedding day. Photos of family vacations in the mountains. Photos of a life I now realized was a complete and utter fraud. The phone, lying face up on the counter, felt like a 50-pound weight. It contained a truth so ugly, so deeply twisted, that I did not know how I could possibly survive it. My own sister. My own flesh and blood. The woman I had shared a bedroom with as a child. For 2 entire days, I existed in a thick, suffocating fog. Monday morning came and I forced myself to drive to my office. I work as a graphic designer, and I sat at my computer monitor, faking polite smiles at my colleagues when they asked about my weekend. I answered client emails. I went to the break room and poured black coffee into a paper cup. But inside my mind, I was screaming. I was tearing the room apart with my bare hands. I thought about confronting him the exact moment he walked through the front door. I thought about screaming, throwing his expensive linen clothes onto the front lawn, smashing the dinner plates against the kitchen wall. But what would that actually accomplish? He would just lie again. He would twist the narrative. He would turn the blame back on me, call me crazy, tell me I was seeing things in a blurry photo, say it was just a random tourist walking by. No. I needed more than just a gut feeling and a distorted reflection on a piece of glass. I needed a wall of solid support. I needed my family. I needed my mother's comforting embrace, my father's stern wisdom to guide me, my older sister Colleen's fierce loyalty to protect me. I was a fool. I was so incredibly naive to think they would be my safe harbor. I gathered them that following weekend. I sent a group text and asked them to meet me at my parents' house on Sunday afternoon. I drove up the familiar suburban driveway, parking my car under the large oak tree where Daphne and I used to play hide and seek as children. I walked up the concrete steps and pushed open the front door. I walked into the living room, the exact same room where we had opened Christmas presents every single year, the room where I had nervously announced my engagement to Preston, the room where Daphne had announced she was dropping out of college because she needed to travel the world, completely blowing through the college fund my parents had set up for her. It was a room heavily saturated with our shared history. I deeply felt that our history would protect me. My mother, Loretta, was sitting in her floral armchair, holding a teacup. My father, Arthur, was lounging on the sofa, reading the Sunday newspaper. My older sister, Colleen, was sitting on the love seat, mindlessly scrolling through her phone. Daphne was sitting cross-legged on the thick carpet, casually filing her nails with an emery board. I stood in the direct center of the room. My hands were shaking so violently that the phone in my tight grip was trembling. My throat felt incredibly dry. I pulled up the photo of Preston. I zoomed in on the sunglasses. "I need you all to look at this," I said, my voice shaking and cracking. "It is Daphne. In the reflection of Preston's glasses. I know it is her. And his shirt when he came back from Chicago, it smelled exactly like her coconut lotion. They are sleeping together." My mother, Loretta, was the very first person to react. She did not even lean forward to glance at the bright screen of the phone. She just closed her eyes and let out a long, dramatic sigh. It was a long-suffering sound she had perfectly honed over years of managing my perceived failures and constantly celebrating Daphne's successes. She placed her teacup carefully on the coaster. "Oh, Valerie," my mother said, waving her hand dismissively in the air. "Honestly. You and your ridiculous abandonment issues. Ever since you were a little girl, you have needed to create dramatic situations just to be the center of attention in this house. I stared at her, completely stunned. My jaw dropped slightly. Mom, please. Just look at the picture. Look at the yellow bikini. It is her. Preston is a wonderful, providing husband, my mother continued, her tone hardening into a sharp edge. And Daphne adores you. You need to stop this nonsense right now before you ruin your own marriage over a silly delusion. I turned my desperate gaze to my father. Arthur was hiding behind the large pages of the weekend newspaper. He lowered the paper just enough to peer at me over the top edge. His eyes were full of that familiar, weary disappointment he always reserved strictly for me. You are working too hard, kiddo, he said flatly, already folding the paper back up, completely dismissing my pain. You are seeing things that are not actually there. Stress can play terrible tricks on your mind. Take a few days off from the design firm and rest. I looked over at my older sister. Colleen did not even bother to look up from her phone screen. She just snorted loudly, a sound of pure mockery. Paranoid much, Valerie? Colleen mocked, her fingers continuing to type a message. Seriously. It is a blurry reflection on a tiny piece of glass. It could be literally anyone on that public beach. You sound completely crazy right now. And then, there was Daphne. Daphne crumpled like a professional stage actress hitting her cue. She dropped her nail file onto the carpet and burst into sudden, violent tears. Big, theatrical, gasping sobs that echoed loudly off the living room walls. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with exaggerated grief. Immediately, the entire dynamic of the room shifted into rapid motion. My mother leaped out of her floral armchair and rushed to the floor, wrapping her arms tightly around Daphne's shaking shoulders. My father put down his newspaper entirely and walked over, patting Daphne's shoulder awkwardly. How could you think that of me? Daphne wailed loudly, her face buried in my mother's shoulder, her voice muffled but perfectly audible. Of Preston? We love you, Valerie. You are my sister. Why are you trying to destroy my life with these lies? I stood there in the center of the living room, completely and utterly alone. The air in the room felt incredibly thin, like I was suffocating. I was surrounded by the 4 people who were supposed to be my absolute sanctuary, my ultimate safety net in a cruel world. And they were looking at me, not with concern, not with maternal or paternal love, but with cold, hard, irritated annoyance. I was not their daughter who was standing there in immense pain. I was not a sister whose heart was currently breaking into a million jagged pieces. I was a problem. I was a messy, inconvenient problem that needed to be managed, shut down quickly, and swept under the living room rug. They had firmly formed a solid wall of denial, and I was standing on the outside in the freezing cold. In that terrible moment, watching my mother gently stroke the blonde hair of the woman who was sleeping with my husband, I finally understood the reality of my life. I saw it with brutal, crystal clarity. They had already chosen a side. And it was not mine. It had never been mine. I was the outsider in my own bloodline. I did not argue further. I did not yell or throw a tantrum. I simply turned around, walked out the front door, got into my car, and drove in complete silence back to my empty house. That night, sitting alone in my dark living room, something deep inside my chest fundamentally changed. The hot, messy, agonizing grief did not magically vanish, but it began to rapidly cool. It began to crystallize. It turned from a painful, throbbing, bleeding wound into something completely cold, incredibly hard, and razor-sharp. The profound sadness was still there, acting as a low hum beneath the surface of my skin, but a brand new feeling was aggressively taking over. Fury. A deep, quiet, methodical fury began to burn right in the exact place where my heart used to be. They thought I was paranoid. They thought I was crazy and hysterical. Fine. If that is what they wanted, I would show them exactly what focused paranoia and a little bit of crazy could really do. My home office was a small spare bedroom down the hall that I had always associated with paying boring utility bills and organizing tax receipts in manila folders. That night, it became my absolute war room. For our entire 7-year marriage, Preston had always handled the heavy finances, insisting that dealing with numbers and spreadsheets stressed me out too much. "I will take care of it, honey. You just focus on your art," he would always say, kissing my forehead gently. I saw it now for exactly what it truly was. A calculated control tactic. A specific way to keep me blind and dependent. I walked into the office and locked the wooden door behind me. I turned on the bright brass desk lamp. I walked to the kitchen, brewed a large pot of black coffee, and brought the entire carafe into the room. I sat down at the computer chair and began aggressively guessing his passwords. It took me 3 frustrating tries, using variations of his favorite sports teams and his birth year, to finally break into our main banking portal. Once I was inside the system, I did not stop. I spent hours upon hours at that desk, heavily fueled by caffeine and a righteous, burning anger. I printed out years of bank statements, credit card bills, and mortgage documents. The laser printer hummed and clacked continuously into the early hours of the morning, spitting out page after page of our financial history. My fingers flew rapidly across the keyboard. My tired eyes scanned endless columns of numbers. Groceries, gas station fill-ups, dry cleaning receipts, expensive dinners out at steakhouses. And then, I found it. It was exactly 3 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. The entire house was completely silent around me, the only sound the software of the computer tower. I was staring at a printed bank statement from exactly 6 months prior. There was a single, massive transaction listed on the page. A $75,000 withdrawal. It was pulled directly from our home equity line of credit. The heck? My breath caught sharply in my throat. I traced the large number with my index finger, leaving a faint smudge of black ink on the white paper. We had taken out that line of credit for absolute emergencies only. We talked about using it if the roof completely caved in, or if one of us had a catastrophic medical crisis that insurance did not cover. We had both sat at the kitchen island, held hands, and sworn a solemn oath never to touch that specific money unless it was a matter of actual life or death. I felt a massive surge of adrenaline flood my system. My hands began to shake again, but this time it was not from sorrow or fear. This was it. This was real, tangible, undeniable proof. A blurry photo on a social media app can be explained away with lies. 75,000 missing dollars from a joint asset cannot. I started tracing the path of the money. It was not incredibly difficult if you actually knew where to look and had the stubborn patience to follow the digital paper trail. The funds had been transferred from our joint checking account directly to a newly opened business checking account at a completely different bank across town. I stared at the routing numbers. I opened a new browser tab and navigated directly to the state's public business registry website. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears I could hear my own pulse as I typed in the name associated with the receiving account. I hit the enter key. The page slowly loaded. The name on the public registry glared back at me in stark black text, Daphne's Designs LLC. Registered agent, Daphne. Address, a commercial retail space in the trendy downtown district. I leaned back heavily in my desk chair, the printed statement shaking violently in my hand. He had stolen from our home. He had drained the hard-earned equity from the house we lived in, the house I helped pay the mortgage on with my salary, to fund his disgusting affair. He took our family's financial future to completely bankroll my sister's ridiculous vanity fashion project. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the betrayal left me completely speechless. This was not just a betrayal of romantic love or marriage vows. It was a cold, highly calculated, financial assault. They were not just sneaking around sleeping together in cheap hotel rooms on the weekends. They were actively building a life together, building a business, standing right on the back of my hard work, my absolute trust, and the roof over my head. But the rabbit hole went much deeper than a fake boutique. Once you start aggressively pulling up the floorboards of your life, you never know how many skeletons you will find buried in the dirt. The next discovery was the specific one that truly, permanently shattered the very last vestiges of my innocence regarding my family. For years, I had always wondered about my inheritance. When my grandmother passed away right after my college graduation, her funeral had been a somber, rainy affair. I stood by the grave and wept bitterly. She was the only person in my entire family who had truly, unconditionally adored me for who I was. Before she died, she had set up a sizable trust fund in my name to ensure I would always have a strong safety net in life. But accessing that money had always been an absolute nightmare. Every single time I brought it up to my mother over the years, she would wave the conversation away with vague, confusing excuses. There are complicated legal issues regarding the custody of the funds, Valerie, Loretta would say, pouring herself a large glass of expensive red wine. The stock market is down right now. It is just not a good time to withdraw. You need to prove you are more financially mature first. You know how careless you are with money. Driven by this terrifying new mental clarity, sitting in my cold office at 4 a.m, I decided to completely bypass my mother entirely. As soon as the sun came up and normal business hours began, I confidently contacted the law firm that managed my late grandmother's estate. It took 3 agonizing days of persistent, borderline harassing phone calls to get anyone on the line who would actually listen to my request. I was treated like a nuisance. The receptionists kept trying to swat me away, transferring me to different silent voicemails. Finally, I demanded to speak to someone in charge and got through to a senior paralegal. Her name was Francine. Francine sounded older, and her voice was filled with a weary sort of professional pity. After strictly verifying my identity using my social security number, my birthdate, and my current address, she paused on the line. I could hear her typing on her keyboard. "You have a legal right to see this file, Mrs. Valerie," Francine said softly over the phone, her tone gentle. "I am going to overnight the complete dossier to your house by a private courier. You should have it by tomorrow afternoon." I almost cried with sheer gratitude. I thanked her profusely, my voice cracking, and hung up the phone. When the thick manila envelope finally arrived by private courier the next afternoon, I signed for it on the front porch. The package felt as heavy as a stone tombstone in my hands. I carried it into the kitchen, sat down at the wooden table, and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside the envelope was a massive stack of official legal documents, several inches thick, tightly bound with metal clips. And right on top of the stack, meticulously organized by date, was a series of formal legal motions filed with the family court over the last 5 years. I read the heading of the first document. The listed petitioner on every single motion was my own mother, Loretta. I read the pages one by one, my vision blurring with hot, stinging tears of absolute, blinding rage. My mother had repeatedly, year after year, petitioned the court to keep my inheritance trust under her sole control. The legal arguments she formally presented to the judge were absolutely horrifying to read. She argued, in sworn legal filings, that I, her own flesh and blood daughter, was mentally and emotionally unstable. She labeled me a proven spendthrift, completely incapable of managing my own daily affairs. She formally requested full legal custody of my finances to protect me from myself. She had viciously weaponized my own private struggles with anxiety. An anxiety that was almost entirely caused by her constant, nagging criticism and my family's cruel treatment of me growing up. She used my pain as a sharp blade against me. She had painted a vivid picture of me to a judge as a fragile, hysterical, incompetent child, all to legally keep her greedy hands firmly on my grandmother's money. My grandmother's loving gift, my ultimate safety net in the world, was being used as a tight leather leash around my neck. As I dug much deeper into the detailed accounting pages attached to the very back of the file, the ugly truth became completely undeniable. My mother was literally funding Daphne's extravagant, careless lifestyle. She was paying Daphne's expensive apartment rent, her luxury car leases, and her designer clothes by illegally withdrawing massive administrative fees from my trust account. She was actively stealing the money that was rightfully mine to support the sister who was sleeping with my husband. That was the exact moment I fully realized the terrifying scope of my dark reality. This was not just a sad story of an affair. This was not just a cheating husband and a terrible, selfish sister. This was not just a theft of our home equity. This was a massive, highly coordinated conspiracy. It was a long-term, calculated campaign executed flawlessly by my entire family to marginalize me, to control me, to strip me of my rightful resources, and to keep me permanently pinned down so they could continuously feed off me. I sat alone in my quiet kitchen, the devastating documents spread out before me on the table like a map of a war zone. I knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that I could never look at any of them the same way again. They had pushed me way too far. I gathered the legal papers, placed them carefully back into the thick manila envelope, and walked back to my home office. It was time to stop crying. It was time to stop being the victim. And it was time to start planning my absolute revenge. If you've made it this far, please do me a favor, like the video and comment number 1 down below. It lets me know how awesome you are and shows that you're right here with me on this journey. Your support is a massive encouragement and truly motivates me. Drop that one so I can recognize you, and now, let's get back to my story. The very next evening, I left my design office feeling completely drained. My eyes burned from staring at the bright computer monitor all day, and my shoulders ached with a heavy, physical tension. I drove home through the thick, crawling evening traffic, my mind racing with 100 different scenarios of how to handle the massive mountain of evidence I had uncovered. I pulled into my driveway. I noticed my mother's silver sedan parked on the street. My older sister Colleen's SUV was parked right behind it. My stomach tied itself into a tight, cold knot. I grabbed my heavy purse from the passenger seat, locked my car door, and walked up the concrete steps to the front porch. I turned the brass key in the lock and pushed the heavy oak door open. The house was completely silent, but all the lights in the living room were turned on. I slipped off my coat, hung it in the hallway closet, and walked slowly into the living room. They were all sitting there. It looked like a carefully arranged tribunal. My mother, Loretta, was sitting on the love seat. My father, Arthur, was sitting rigidly in the wingback chair. Colleen was leaning against the fireplace mantel. Preston and Daphne were sitting close together on the main sofa. And sitting in the center of the room, in my favorite reading chair, was a man I had never seen before. He wore an expensive, tailored charcoal gray suit. He had thick silver hair neatly combed back, and a profoundly calm, professional smile that did not quite reach his cold, assessing eyes. The sheer level of coordination it must have taken to assemble everyone in my living room while I was at work was terrifying. My mother stood up instantly, smoothing the front of her blouse. Her face was twisted into a perfect, practiced mask of deep, loving concern. "Valerie, darling," my mother said softly, walking toward me with her hands outstretched. "We were all so incredibly worried about you. We simply did not know what else to do. Please, come sit down. This is Dr. Leonard Brooks. He is a highly respected psychiatrist, and he is here to help you." I froze in the doorway. The air in the room suddenly felt thick and unbreathable. I looked at the strange man in my reading chair. Dr. Brooks nodded at me slowly, his hands resting neatly on his lap. "Good evening, Valerie," Dr. Brooks said. His voice was smooth as expensive silk. "Your family cares for you deeply. We are just going to have a little chat." I did not move toward them. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, my fingernails digging into my own sleeves. They took turns speaking to me, their voices overlapping in a perfectly rehearsed performance. My mother spoke of my erratic behavior over the past few weeks. Colleen brought up my sudden, unprovoked anger at the family gathering. Preston leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and spoke softly about my supposed delusions regarding him and my sister. He actually managed to squeeze out a single, fake tear, talking about how my unhealthy obsession with our family finances was tearing our marriage apart. They used the very evidence of their own crimes as absolute proof of my mental instability. The bank statements I had been printing at 3 in the morning were not proof of theft, they claimed. They were evidence of my paranoid financial fixation. My questions about the inheritance from my grandmother were framed as greedy delusions. The photo on the beach was not proof of an affair. It was proof of my severe persecution complex. Dr. Brooks sat perfectly still, listening to all of their lies, nodding patiently and taking small notes in a leather-bound notebook. Then, he finally turned his calm, assessing gaze directly onto me. "Valerie," he said, tapping his expensive pen against the notebook. "From what your family has meticulously described to me, and from what I am observing right now in your highly agitated, defensive state, I am heavily inclined to agree with them. I believe that a short, voluntary stay at a private residential facility would be immensely beneficial for you. Just a quiet place for a few weeks to rest, to get your scrambled thoughts in order, and to get back to being yourself without the heavy stress of your daily life." My blood ran completely cold. It was not a metaphor. I literally felt the warm blood drain from my face and my limbs. They were not just trying to gaslight me anymore. This was a massive escalation. They were actively trying to have me legally declared incompetent. They wanted to lock me away in a facility, discredit me completely, and gain full legal custody of my physical person and my assets so they could take absolutely everything I owned without a single fight. I slowly looked at their faces, one by one, letting the terrifying reality wash over me. My mother wore a tight, determined smile of a long-suffering martyr. My father looked weary and resigned, already fully convinced of my guilt and my madness. My older sister Colleen looked smug and entirely indifferent. And Preston and Daphne were sitting side by side on my own sofa, actually holding hands right in front of me now, looking at me with matching expressions of pure, feigned sympathy. In that single, horrifying moment, a heavy metal switch flipped deep inside my brain. The lingering fear, the deep hurt, the overwhelming confusion, it all completely vanished. The emotional noise stopped. It was instantly replaced by an arctic calm, a chilling, terrifying clarity. I was completely done being the victim in this family. I was done crying myself to sleep. I was done being their emotional punching bag and their financial bank account. I slowly lowered my head, letting my hair fall forward over my face to completely hide the sudden, cold fire that had ignited in my eyes. I took a shaky, deliberate breath. I forced my shoulders to slump forward in defeat. It was a perfect, award-winning performance for my captive audience. "Okay," I whispered. I let my voice crack perfectly on cue, making it sound small and broken. "Maybe you are all right. I am so tired. I am just so tired of fighting all the time. I will think about it. Please, just let me go upstairs and sleep. I cannot handle this right now." I peeked through my hair and saw the immediate look of triumphant relief they eagerly exchanged over my bowed head. My mother let out a loud breath. Preston squeezed Daphne's hand. They genuinely thought they had finally won the war. They thought they had finally broken my spirit into a million pieces. They had absolutely no idea that they had just fully armed me for battle. I turned around and walked slowly up the wooden stairs to my bedroom, dragging my feet to sell the performance of a defeated woman. But inside my mind, one single thought loudly echoed, forming a silent, vicious promise. My 34th birthday dinner was exactly 2 weeks away. They had all insisted on celebrating it to keep up their perfect family appearances. And I was going to throw myself a birthday party that none of them would ever forget. The very next morning, I woke up before the sun even crested the horizon. The weak, defeated victim I had been the night before was completely gone. In her place was a highly motivated client. A client with a singular, burning purpose. Before Preston even stirred in the bed beside me, I was sitting on the bathroom floor with my laptop. I logged into my private savings account, a totally separate account that Preston knew absolutely nothing about. It was money I had painstakingly earned over the years from doing freelance graphic design projects late at night. I kept it hidden for a rainy day. Well, it was currently pouring. I executed a wire transfer, moving the entire balance into a brand new, highly secure account at a completely different banking institution under solely my name. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, I walked out of my office building on my coffee break and made my first phone call. I dialed the direct office number of Miriam Vance. Her name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones in the specific legal circles I had been furiously researching online all night. Miriam Vance was an absolute shark in a tailored designer suit. She was a high-powered divorce lawyer so utterly ruthless and terrifyingly competent that she was famous in the city for making arrogant, cheating husbands weep openly on the witness stand. Later that afternoon, I used my lunch hour to walk into her sleek, minimalist office suite overlooking the downtown skyline. The waiting room smelled of expensive leather and fresh lilies. When the receptionist ushered me into her private office, I did not cry. I did not tremble or shake. I sat down in the firm leather chair opposite her massive glass desk and laid out the entire story, keeping my voice completely even and low. I opened my large tote bag and placed each piece of printed evidence directly onto her pristine glass desk. The bank statements highlighting the stolen $75,000. The printed registry of Daphne's fake business. The zoomed-in beach photo. And finally, the massive stack of fraudulent court motions my mother had filed regarding my grandmother's inheritance trust. Miriam Vance listened to me for 45 uninterrupted minutes. She did not speak a single word. She kept her perfectly manicured fingers steepled under her chin, her dark, sharp eyes intensely focused on my face. When I finally finished speaking, the room fell into a heavy silence. The only sound was the ticking of a modern clock on her wall. Miriam leaned back slowly in her large leather chair and studied me for a very long moment. A brief flicker of something that looked remarkably like professional admiration crossed her stern face. "They did not just break your heart, Valerie," Miriam said. Her voice was a low, dangerous purr that commanded immediate respect. "They committed felony fraud, corporate embezzlement, financial conspiracy, and grand larceny. The dirty affair with your sister is honestly the absolute least of their legal problems right now." She leaned forward, resting her arms on the desk. "So tell me, Valerie. What exactly is it you want to do about this?" "I want to burn their entire world to the ground," I said clearly, the words tasting like ash and absolute freedom on my tongue. "I want everything back, and I want them to pay." A slow, wolfish smile spread across Miriam's face. "I can easily do that. But first, we need more. We need ironclad, irrefutable proof of the affair and the daily fraud to completely destroy any narrative they try to spin in court. We need things they cannot possibly talk their way out of." She picked up her sleek desk phone and dialed a short extension. "I am hiring you a private investigator immediately. His name is Gordon Hayes. He is expensive as hell, but he is a complete ghost. He gets things that no one else can." I agreed to his retainer fee without a second thought. I met Gordon Hayes 2 days later in a quiet, dimly lit coffee shop on the edge of town. He was the complete opposite of what I had expected a private investigator to look like. He was a quiet, unassuming man in his late 50s. He wore a rumpled tweed jacket and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked much more like a tired high school history teacher grading papers than a ruthless PI. But his mild appearance was his greatest weapon. He was brutally effective. For the next 10 days, I lived a terrifying double life. At home, I played the part of the broken, compliant wife. I smiled weakly at Preston. I attended a dreadful Sunday dinner at my parents' house, sitting silently while they patronized me. I pretended to consider Dr. Brooks's facility. Meanwhile, Gordon was working. In just under a week and a half, he sent a highly encrypted digital folder to Miriam's office. It was an absolute treasure trove of my family's deceit. Gordon had managed to itemize hotel receipts from Preston and Daphne's supposed business trips over the past year. The receipts were complete with room service charges for expensive champagne, chocolate-covered strawberries, and couples massages. He had taken high-resolution, time-stamped photographs of them aggressively kissing in the parking lot outside a romantic Italian restaurant 2 towns over. But the most damning piece of evidence was the audio. We live in a one-party consent state for recording conversations. Gordon had managed to get close enough to my mother while she was having lunch with my aunt at a country club to capture crystal-clear audio. He recorded my mother openly laughing over her Cobb salad about how she was masterfully managing my inheritance, keeping me compliant, constantly doubting my own sanity, and keeping me completely out of the way so Daphne could finally have the luxury boutique she always dreamed of. Every single digital file, every piece of hard evidence, was another heavy iron nail hammered into their collective coffin. I sat in Miriam's office as we compiled it all together. We organized everything into what Miriam chillingly called the dossiers of truth. We had a professional printing company bind 5 identical, thick, spiral-bound booklets. They were highly organized with color-coded tabs for each category of betrayal. 1 dossier for Preston. 1 for Daphne. 1 for Loretta. 1 for Arthur. And 1 for Colleen. But as we were finalizing the master plan for the upcoming birthday dinner, a dark, nagging thought kept creeping into my mind. It was a tiny seed of doubt that had been planted during the horrifying intervention in my living room, and it had grown into an absolute obsession. I thought back carefully on my entire life, replaying decades of memories in my mind. Daphne was always the absolute golden child of the family. She got the brand new, shiny convertible for her sweet 16th birthday party. I got a heavily used, 10-year-old sedan that constantly broke down. Her entire college tuition was fully paid for at an expensive private arts college, which she promptly dropped out of after 2 semesters. Meanwhile, I was sternly steered toward the local in-state public university and aggressively told to apply for student loans and scholarships because money was tight. My mother constantly praised Colleen's athletic achievements and Daphne's beauty, while looking at my drawings with barely concealed disdain. It was infinitely more than just typical sibling favoritism. It was a deep, systemic, lifelong pattern of being treated as a secondary citizen in my own home. I was treated like an outsider. Like a burden they were legally forced to carry. During a late-night strategy phone call with Miriam, pacing back and forth on my back patio while Preston slept inside, I finally voiced the dark thought that had been haunting my waking hours. Miriam, it is like I am not even their actual kid, I said quietly, the heavy words coming out in a sudden rush of exhausted frustration. The way my father looks at me. Like he is disgusted by my very existence. There was a very long, heavy pause on the other end of the telephone line. I could hear Miriam breathing. Valerie, Miriam said, her voice suddenly extremely careful and measured. We still have Gordon Hayes on retainer for another 2 days before the dinner. It is a massive long shot, and it might open a wound you cannot close. But do you want us to actually find out? A wild, terrifying, and completely exhilarating idea fully took hold of me. It felt like the absurd plot of a cheap daytime soap opera. It was insane. But my daily life was already a sick, twisted melodrama. So, what was one more massive plot twist at this point? Yes, I said firmly into the phone, my voice barely above a harsh whisper in the cold night air, but my internal conviction was absolute. I need to know the truth. All of it. Gordon Hayes was an absolute master of his secretive craft. The very next morning, my father Arthur made a brief, highly awkward visit to my house to drop off some mail that had been delivered there by mistake. I offered him a cup of coffee to go. He drank half of it in his car before tossing the disposable cup into the trash can at the end of my driveway. That discarded paper cup, bearing my father's saliva, was all Gordon needed. Gordon retrieved it securely and overnight the sample to a highly confidential, expedited private DNA laboratory. The lab promised the official results would be delivered electronically on the exact afternoon of my 34th birthday. The day of the dinner party. The ultimate day of reckoning. The night of my birthday dinner finally arrived. It felt completely surreal, like I was watching a movie of my own life playing out from a very great distance. I spent an hour doing my makeup, making sure my face looked flawless and entirely unbothered. I wore a stunning emerald green dress that Preston had never seen before. We were dining in the plush, beautifully decorated, soundproof private dining room of Love LV. It was an absurdly expensive, highly exclusive French restaurant downtown that my mother absolutely adored but rarely went to because of the exorbitant prices. I had insisted on booking the private room and paying for the entire evening. It was the perfect, enclosed stage for the grand performance to come. The air inside the private room was thick with the heavy scent of expensive designer perfume, rich roasted meats, and suffocating hypocrisy. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn shut. They were all sitting around the large circular mahogany table, dressed in their absolute finest evening wear. Their faces were carefully arranged in tight masks of fond celebration and relief. They truly, genuinely thought this expensive dinner was their ultimate victory lap. They thought it was a grand celebration of my final, pathetic surrender to their twisted narrative. They thought I was going to announce that I was checking into Dr. Brooks's facility the very next morning. The waiters poured expensive champagne into crystal flutes. My father, Arthur, stood up at the head of the table, tapping his knife gently against his glass to make the first toast. He raised his flute of champagne high in the air. To Valerie, Arthur said loudly, his deep voice resonating around the small room with a heavy layer of false sincerity. We are all so incredibly glad you have finally decided to let go of all that toxic anger. We are proud of you for embracing the spirit of forgiveness. In the end, as we always say, family is absolutely all that matters. He smiled at me, a tight, forced expression, and took a sip. My mother, Loretta, followed his lead immediately. She dabbed at the dry corner of her eye with a pristine white linen napkin, producing a perfect crocodile tear. To moving forward, together, Loretta chimed in, her sharp eyes gleaming with victorious triumph in the dim restaurant lighting. And to getting you the professional help and support you truly need right now. We will always be right here for you, darling. No matter what. I looked across the table. Preston and Daphne sat right beside each other. Their heavy wooden chairs were pulled just a little too close together. I could clearly see the fabric of Preston's suit pants shifting. Their hands were actively brushing against each other under the white tablecloth. They looked directly at me with that sickening, proprietary blend of fake pity and massive self-satisfaction. They thought they had won the ultimate prize. I let them finish their disgusting charade. I smiled warmly at all of them. I picked up my crystal water glass and took a slow, highly deliberate sip of my ice water. My heart was beating a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. I was completely amazed to find that I was no longer nervous. My hands were not shaking. I felt powerful. I felt like a blunt instrument of absolute fate. Across the room, sitting quietly at a small, two-person overflow table near the heavy oak door, I met Miriam Vance's eyes. She was looking incredibly chic and highly predatory in a tailored black silk blouse, nursing a club soda with lime, exactly as we had carefully planned. I gave her the absolute slightest nod of my head. This was it. Showtime. Miriam Vance stood up slowly. The sharp, rhythmic click of her expensive designer heels on the polished hardwood floor was the only sound in the suddenly quiet dining room. All 5 heads turned rapidly to look at the strange woman approaching our private table. She moved with the unhurried, terrifying grace of a hungry panther circling its prey. She stopped right at the edge of the large circular table. "Good evening, everyone," Miriam said. Her voice was incredibly cool, loud, and crystal clear. It cut right through the comfortable, congratulatory atmosphere of the room like a jagged shard of broken glass. "My name is Miriam Vance. I am Valerie's legal attorney." The fake smiles instantly froze solid on their faces. Complete, utter confusion rapidly flickered in their eyes, quickly followed by a dawning, heavy sense of deep alarm. Preston dropped his fork onto his porcelain plate with a loud clatter. "Valerie was so incredibly touched by your deep concern for her mental well-being recently that she wanted to share a few special party favors with all of you tonight," Miriam continued seamlessly, her professional voice completely devoid of any human emotion. Behind her, the heavy oak door to the private room opened quietly. Her young, grim-faced male paralegal assistant, who had been waiting patiently in the hallway, stepped forward into the room. In his arms, he held a massive stack of 5 extremely thick, heavy, spiral-bound dossiers. He moved silently around the large circular table, pausing behind each chair. He placed one heavy dossier directly down on the white tablecloth in front of each of them with a loud, authoritative thud. One for Preston. One for Daphne. One for my mother, Loretta. One for my father, Arthur. And one for my older sister, Colleen. Absolute, suffocating silence descended on the room. No one dared to breathe. No one moved a single muscle. They stared down at the thick black booklets resting next to their dinner plates as if the binders were venomous snakes ready to strike. "Go on," I said softly. My voice was barely above a quiet whisper, yet it carried the heavy, undeniable weight of an absolute command. "Open your gifts. I made them specifically for you." My father, Arthur, was the very first person to obey. His physical movements were incredibly stiff, like an old machine. He reached out with a trembling hand and flipped open the thick black plastic cover. His face instantly went completely slack. All the remaining color aggressively drained from his skin, leaving him looking like a pale ghost. The very first page of the dossier was a high-resolution, glossy 8x10 photograph. It was the photo Gordon Hayes had taken. It showed Preston and Daphne locked in a highly passionate, open-mouthed kiss on the outdoor balcony of a luxury hotel, the bright city lights of Chicago twinkling clearly behind them in the dark night sky. Daphne let out a loud, strangled gasp, violently snatching her own dossier off the table. She flipped frantically through the thick pages, tearing the paper in her haste. Each new tab section revealed a fresh, heavily documented horror. There were itemized luxury hotel receipts clearly bearing both of their legal names. There were dozens of printed pages of transcripts of their private text messages. Messages filled with cruel, mocking jokes at my absolute expense. Graphic sexual innuendos. And highly detailed, step-by-step financial plans for funding her boutique using my house. "Once Valerie is finally settled and locked in that rest facility, we will have all the time in the world to travel." Daphne read one of Preston's texts out loud, her voice cracking in pure panic. Preston did not speak. He just sat frozen, staring down at his personal copy. His mouth was slightly agape, his handsome face turning a pasty, sickly white color. He aggressively flipped to the next section, heavily tabbed financials. He stared at the printed bank statements. The massive $75,000 transfer was highlighted in blinding fluorescent yellow marker. Attached right behind it were the official state articles of incorporation for Daphne's Designs LLC. Preston's legal signature as a financial guarantor was printed clearly on every single page. His breathing became shallow and rapid. Several senior partners from Preston's logistics firm were currently dining out in the main room of the restaurant tonight. He had specifically chosen this restaurant hoping to bump into his boss and secure a promotion. Miriam had already ensured a copy of this financial fraud file was sitting on the desk of his company's human resources director. His career, his desperate hope for a massive promotion, and his entire professional reputation were completely over. My older sister Colleen, who always had a sharp, cruel comment for every situation, was for once in her miserable life completely speechless. She stared at the printed text threads she was a part of, group chats where she actively called me unhinged, crazy, and repeatedly told Daphne to just ignore my complaints. "She will get over it, she always does," Colleen had texted. Now, those words stared back at her in black and white. My mother, Loretta, was made of much stronger, colder stuff than the rest of them. She did not look at the photos of the affair. She glared intensely across the table directly at me, her eyes filled with pure, unadulterated venom. But then, her manicured fingers aggressively flipped to her own specific tab section labeled Estate. Her carefully constructed, aristocratic composure violently shattered into a million pieces. Her face completely crumpled, aging 10 years in a matter of seconds, as she read the precise transcripts of her own spoken words. She stared at the transcript of the recorded phone calls Gordon had captured of her lunch at the country club. The audio detailing exactly how she had knowingly filed fraudulent legal motions to block my inheritance, repeatedly calling me unstable to the judge. She had even openly bragged on the recording about how stealing my trust fund would secure a much higher personal salary for her own retirement lifestyle, since she would not have to worry about supporting me or Daphne anymore. The final page in her massive section was a formal, stamped legal notice from Miriam Vance's law office. It was the official notification of an impending, massive civil lawsuit for felony fraud, corporate embezzlement, and severe financial misconduct. But the grand show was not over yet. Not by a long shot. Miriam let the horrified, suffocating silence hang heavy in the air for a long moment, letting them truly absorb the absolute destruction of their lives. Then, she calmly reached into her designer leather satchel and produced one last, single document inside a plastic sleeve. She stepped forward and placed it with a soft thud directly in the center of the large table, right next to the floral centerpiece. "There is one final piece of important information," Miriam announced loudly to the completely stunned room. "A serious matter of paternity that clarifies a great deal about the historical dynamics of this family." She used one manicured finger to slide the single sheet of paper directly toward my father, Arthur. It was a certified, stamped laboratory report. A comprehensive DNA analysis. "This official medical report confirms with 99.999% absolute certainty," Miriam said, her voice ringing out with the clear, cold, terrifying finality of a judge's wooden gavel striking a block, "that you, Arthur, share absolutely zero genetic markers with Valerie. You are not her biological father." A collective, highly strangled gasp went through the entire room. Even the waiters standing near the door looked shocked. Arthur slowly looked up from the damning piece of medical paper. He slowly turned his head to look directly at my mother, Loretta. His face was a tragic mask of utter, profound, world-shattering betrayal. The entire foundation of their 35-year marriage, the foundation of his entire adult life, had just been completely obliterated on the white tablecloth of an expensive French restaurant. However, Miriam added smoothly, twisting the proverbial knife into their chests with surgical precision, "We do have legal reason to believe we know exactly who the real father is." Miriam looked directly at me. For the first time all evening, there was a genuine glimmer of human sympathy in her otherwise cold, professional gaze. "Her godfather," Miriam stated clearly. "A man who has always treated her with nothing but absolute kindness and respect. Judge Wallace." It was a total, undeniable checkmate. The private dining room was a horrific tableau of absolute ruin. My mother, Loretta, had completely collapsed into guttural, ugly, heaving sobs. It was not the sound of genuine remorse for what she had done to me, but the sound of pure, selfish panic at her total public exposure. She had lost her husband, her reputation, and her stolen money all in 5 minutes. My father, Arthur, was staring blankly into empty space, his jaw hanging open, his entire world turned completely inside out. Daphne and Preston were looking at each other in raw, vibrating panic, their shared fantasy future of stolen money and illicit love evaporating into thin air right before their very eyes. My sister Colleen just looked violently sick to her stomach, holding her napkin over her mouth, finally realizing she had aggressively backed the wrong side in a vicious war she did not even fully understand. In the immediate aftermath of the massive explosion, there was only a ringing, deafening silence inside my own head. The faint sound of clinking wine glasses and soft jazz music leaking in from the main restaurant outside our private room seemed like a completely different universe away. My family, or the pathetic collection of terrible people I had once foolishly called my family, were frozen solid. They were shattered, broken figures in a terrifying wax museum of their own making, each currently trapped in their own personal hell of absolute exposure. I slowly stood up from my chair. My legs, which had felt like weak jelly for the past several months, were now massive pillars of solid stone. I did not shout. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. The time for that weakness was long past. I looked at each of them, my gaze moving incredibly slowly around the circular table, lingering for a heavy moment on each ruined, terrified face. I looked down at Preston, my husband. A man I now clearly saw not as a devastating heartbreaker, but as a weak, pathetic, cowardly thief. He was a hollow shell of a man propped up entirely by lies and my money. I looked over at Daphne, my sister. Her lifelong golden child glow was finally, permanently extinguished, leaving only a greedy, panicked, and surprisingly plain-looking woman cowering in its place. I looked at Arthur, the man who had raised me with a quiet, constant, heavy disapproval that I now, with heartbreaking clarity, finally understood. He knew I was not his, even if he did not have the proof until tonight. Then, my cold gaze finally landed right on my mother, Loretta. The chief architect of my lifelong pain. The evil mastermind of this grand, sweeping deception. She was staring back up at me. Her face was heavily streaked with running black mascara. She had a look of pure, undiluted hatred burning in her eyes. It was the desperate look of a cornered, vicious animal caught in a trap. And in that precise moment, looking down at the woman who literally gave birth to me, I felt absolutely nothing. I felt no love. I felt no anger. I felt not even a single ounce of pity. I just felt a massive void. An empty, quiet space where a lifetime of desperate feeling used to be. You took years of my life, I said. My voice was very quiet, but it carried to every dark corner of the room with the devastating force of a massive wrecking ball. You took my peace. You took my trust. And you aggressively stole my money. You actually tried to take my sanity and lock me away to steal my freedom. I paused, making sure they heard every single word. You will not get one more second of my time. You will not get one more word from my mouth. I calmly picked up my pristine, folded linen napkin and placed it neatly on the table right beside my completely untouched plate of expensive food. This was the absolute last meal we will ever share, I stated loudly. It was not a dramatic threat. It was a simple, immutable fact of the universe. I looked at Preston. My lawyer will handle the divorce papers. You will be served at your office on Monday morning. I turned my eyes back to my mother. She will handle the massive civil lawsuit for my full inheritance, plus severe punitive damages. And she will aggressively handle the legal recovery of the stolen $75,000 from both of you. I looked at Preston and Daphne one last time. Have the beautiful lives you all so richly deserve. With that final sentence, Miriam Vance and I turned around and walked out of the heavy oak doors of the private room. I did not look back. I did not need to. I could literally feel the massive weight of their entire world violently collapsing into rubble behind me. I could feel the shockwaves of their absolute implosion. And for the very first time in my entire adult life, I was not buried underneath it. I was walking away from the toxic rubble, stepping out of the restaurant doors, and walking into the clean, cool, refreshing night air. I was finally, blessedly, free. A year can change absolutely everything in a person's life. I am writing this story today sitting on the wide, wooden wraparound porch of a beautiful house on a quiet lake. It is my house. And the absolute best part? It is the exact same sprawling, cedar-shingled lake house my family used to own. They were brutally forced to sell it in a desperate fire sale just to cover their catastrophic, mounting legal fees and their massive debts. After my divorce from Preston was quickly finalized in court, and my aggressive civil lawsuit successfully clawed back every single penny of my stolen inheritance, plus massive punitive damages from my mother, I bought the lake house through a carefully constructed anonymous shell corporation. My family never even knew it was me who bought it from the bank. The quiet, daily pleasure of sitting on this porch, knowing that irony, is far sweeter than any loud revenge. The air out here on the lake smells faintly of pine needles, damp earth, and the coming rain. It does not smell of deceit, lies, and cheap artificial coconut lotion. My daily life is incredibly quiet now, And I have finally learned that peace and quiet is the absolute most valuable commodity on this entire earth. Preston and Daphne's luxury boutique never even opened its doors. Their disgusting affair, made incredibly public in the most spectacular and detailed way during the lawsuit, completely torched their professional careers and their social lives. The last I heard through the grapevine, they were living in a cramped, dark two-bedroom apartment 2 states away, totally drowning in massive credit card debt and boiling in mutual resentment toward each other. The perfect, happy couple. Arthur and Loretta's divorce was as brutal, vicious, and swift as you might imagine. The shocking public revelation of my true paternity at the dinner table was a massive bomb from which their 35-year marriage could simply never recover. My father, Arthur, sent me one single letter in the mail about 6 months ago. It was a short, stilted, handwritten note full of a heavy remorse that came exactly 34 years too late. I read it once, standing in my kitchen. And then I struck a match and burned it in the sink. I never wrote him back. The most profound, beautiful change, however, the one that has truly, deeply healed the most broken parts of my soul, was connecting with my real biological father. Judge Wallace. He was a man who had been a kind, gentle, peripheral godfather figure my entire life. When I finally found the courage to pick up the phone, call him, and tell him absolutely everything, he drove 4 straight hours to see me that exact same afternoon. He wept openly, sitting right here on this very porch. He told me he had loved my mother once, a lifetime ago, but she had ultimately chosen Arthur because Arthur offered a life of more immediate financial stability. She had never, ever told Wallace she was pregnant with his child. Now, we are eagerly making up for so much lost time. He is fully retired from the bench now. He visits the lake house very often. We sit on the wooden dock and fish for hours. We work together planting vegetables in the garden. We talk late into the night. We are actively building something completely new, real, and totally honest, right on top of the ashes of all those old, toxic lies. I used a large portion of my reclaimed inheritance money, the money my grandmother always lovingly intended for me to have, to start a small, non-profit foundation. I called it the Lighthouse Fund. The fund provides initial pro bono legal consultations and free psychological support therapy for women who are desperately trying to safely extricate themselves from toxic, financially abusive, and manipulative family situations. It is my personal way of turning the absolute ugliest, most painful thing that ever happened to me into a bright, shining beacon for someone else who is currently lost in a dark storm. My new friends, the few true, loyal ones who firmly stood by my side when I had nothing but a crazy story and a broken heart, helped me run the foundation. I used to foolishly think that family was a strict obligation. I thought it was an immutable, unbreakable bond of shared blood that you were permanently stuck with, for better or for worse, no matter how badly they treated you. Now, I know with absolute certainty that is simply not true. True family is a solid bond of mutual trust, of deep respect, and of absolute physical and emotional safety. It is the beautiful family you consciously choose to build around yourself, not the toxic one you just happen to be born into by genetic chance. The greatest wealth in the world is not having millions of dollars in the bank, and it is not even having a beautiful cedar house on a quiet lake. It is peace. A deep, unshakable, quiet peace inside your own soul. And I have finally, after a lifetime of desperate searching and crying, found it. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. It was not an easy thing to share, dragging up all these painful memories, but I felt like I absolutely had to. I know someone out there needed to hear it. If you've made it this far, please do me a favor, like the video and comment number 1 down below. It lets me know how awesome you are and shows that you're right here with me on this journey. Your support is a massive encouragement and truly motivates me. Drop that one so I can recognize you, and now, let me ask you one final question. For anyone out there who has ever felt trapped or betrayed by their own blood, what is the single most important quality you believe makes a real family? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if my journey resonated with you, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel for more. You never know whose story might give you the exact strength you need to finally walk away. Stay strong, and take care of yourselves.